Welcome to the Wounds of the Faithful podcast, brought to you by DSW Ministries. Your host is singer, songwriter, speaker, and domestic violence advocate Diana Winkler. She is passionate about helping survivors in the church heal from domestic violence and abuse and trauma. This podcast is not a substitute for professional counseling or qualified medical help. Now, here is Diana.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad that you're here. How are you guys doing? We have an excellent show for you today. It's going to be a little different. We're going to be talking about sexual abuse, pedophiles in the church. It's a dark topic and very disturbing, but these things have to be said. Something has to be done about it. We have a fabulous guest for you today. I only bring on the best of the best on this show for you guys. We have Jimmy Hinton here today. He is the pastor at Somerset Church of Christ in Somerset, PA. He is a graduate of Harding School of Theology and Jack P. Lewis Ministry of Study Award recipient. He is a safeguarding specialist with GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. He specializes in training deception techniques of skilled abusers who molest children in plain sight. There is a trigger warning for this episode. I'm a survivor and I've been an advocate for 11 years about. And the subject really, I've cried many times listening to his podcast, and we are going to be talking about his new book called The Devil Inside: How My Minister Father Molested Kids in Our Home in Church for Decades and How I Finally Stopped Him. I still want you to listen to the episode because the information that he's going to give us today is phenomenal. I think he is the best podcast on sexual abuse of minors in the church. And you will find out why. He had to turn his own father in for abusing all these children. One of them was in his own family. So Jimmy and his mother Clara turned him into the police. So many other things have happened to Jimmy and his family. They've experienced not only the aftermath of the abuse, but they lost a close family member. Jimmy's brother died also, and so you're going to hear Jimmy's story today. And if it gets really dark and uncomfortable for you, come back to it later. Just take a break and come back later to it, because the information that he's going to give is going to be extremely helpful in recognizing these pedophiles, what we can do about it. And he is probably the foremost researcher out there doing this. Just reading his book, listening to his podcast, and the videos on his website is mind-blowing. I learned so much. I think you will be really blessed. All right, please welcome Pastor Jimmy Hinton to the show. Thanks so much for coming on and your busy schedule.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
I am so stoked to have another abuse advocate on the show, so we can support one another and help our listeners to know about these topics. And I've been telling my Mending the Soul group all about your ministry. Because the ones in my group they all have like multiple generational, severe childhood and adult sexual trauma. One was sex trafficked by her own family.
Wow.
And so I told them that you were coming on the show to promote your book. And so they will be listening to this podcast.
Very good. Excellent.
So we're here to talk about your new book, The Devil Inside. You know, I'll have to say that everyone's been telling me, you know, you have to write a book. You have to write a book. And, you know, I didn't really think that my story would be a bestseller. So I was just going to write a book about helping churches identify and prevent abuse in their congregation.
Yeah.
And then I found your ministry and I thought, well, Jimmy's already doing a better job than I could ever do on that subject. So I'd rather promote your book than write my own.
Yeah. I don't know about better. It's probably different. Everybody's unique. Everybody has a unique angle, and the fact that we have other advocates out there who are doing their thing, I think is super encouraging, and it's tremendous. So yeah, don't undersell yourself. We all are needed out there. We really are. Takes a mountain of people to keep our kids safe.
Well, I'm a musician and I'd rather write music and release an album instead of writing a book. So
Sure. Yeah.
I'm in the process now of compiling a second album, which will be a concept album about healing. So yeah, all my energy is going into that.
Yeah.
So I found out about your ministry through Sandy Kirkham. She was on my show and her book's on the shelf behind me. And
yeah, excellent book.
Yeah, so I was researching her and I saw her on your show, and then you were on Preacher Boy's show, and so I thought, well, I need to look into more on Jimmy Hinton's website.
Sure.
So I started binging everything on your website. Those videos on the deception tactics taken from the magician's techniques just blew me away.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you can ask me specific questions about that, but you know, since you brought it up, my connection with doctors Stephen Macknick and his wife, Susana Martinez Conde, both neuroscientists, both incredibly intelligent. That came from doing my own research and just writing letters back and forth between my dad and I from prison, and asking them really specific questions. And there were just so many gaps in research on child abuse that I saw that just didn't fit. And, you know, just missing information and some misinformation. And I started thinking, you know, that the techniques that my dad is describing really were methodical and rehearsed, and it sounds like what magicians do, like that practice in front of the mirror and just get their act so down pat that it becomes this monotonous, boring routine, just the way he was describing it. And so I started looking for books that had anything to do with abuse in plain sight and kind of sleight of hands things, as it related to child sexual abuse, and there was absolutely nothing. And researchers would mention abuse in plain sight, and keep in mind, this is, I mean, years before Larry Nassar, the U.S. Olympic doctor, before that all came out. People weren't really talking about abuse in plain sight until Larry Nassar. So I had been researching it for years. I couldn't find anything, and so quite accidentally, I found Doctors Macknick and Martinez Conde's book, Sleights of Mind, and I read it. I gobbled it up. I read it in like 2 sittings, and I'm telling you, it was this light bulb moment where, I mean, it made every hair on my body stand up, and I was like, this is the key to unlocking so much understanding in how abusers work. And so a book from 2 neuroscientists that had nothing to do with abuse also had everything to do with it. And so when the Larry Nassar stuff came public in January of 2018, I wrote another blog post about abuse in plain sight and referenced their books, Lights of Mind. And then I just emailed them because I was like, I've been using their research for a couple years now, and I never even contacted them. So I sent them my blog post, and immediately they responded, and they were like, my goodness, when are we going to get together?
Yes.
So we just struck up a conversation and ended up creating a friendship. And they came here to Somerset, where I live, and that's where those videos were shot that you watched that are on my website. And it was phenomenal to listen to them.
Yes.
Just so informational.
I mean, that was like a weekend seminar or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, that was a real education, and I would have expected you to charge for those videos or put them on Patreon or something, but they're free right on your website. Yep. And so, you know, the listeners, you need to go watch these videos for sure.
Yeah.
I already read your bio for the listeners, and I already had to give a trigger warning because your family story is dark, and your family's been through so much and so much heartbreak, but your story needs to be told. It is so powerful, and God has been using you guys to change people's lives. Now, your book, there were definitely parts in the book where I cried. And but I'm so glad that you told stories about growing up. I really enjoyed reading about your wonderful family. Yeah. So could we start there?
Sure. Yeah. I really wanted to give people a behind the veil look into what our childhood was like from a child's perspective growing up, because it's something that you don't often hear about in the families, within the family members of abusers. So that was, of course, at a time where we had no idea that he was an abuser, and he was abusing siblings of mine in the same home. So their childhood was completely different than the childhood of mine and my brothers. So I wrote it really from my perspective, but you know, our childhood, by all definitions of a normal Christian childhood, I mean, it was it. We fit the bill for the normal Christian family. If anything, all these stories that you hear of these ultra right, people living in a bubble and having these really ultra strict legalistic parents, that was not our childhood. It was fun. It was full of laughter. We all pranked each other all the time. We wrestled with each other. The oldest is a girl, and then there are 5 boys in a row, with me being the 5th in that strand, and then 2 girls, a boy, and 2 girls. So with 5 boys in a row, you can imagine it was wild. And we ripped and teared. We lived on 23 acres. We were very secluded, and our parents gave us free reign. And both mom and dad were incredibly supportive. They were very encouraging to us kids. They wanted us to further our education. There was my 3rd older brother, and then the next one, and then myself, all skipped our senior year of high school. Our parents encouraged it. They wanted us to go to college. I was just barely 17 years old when I started college, and I still remember the talk that my dad gave me before I left for college at the fresh age of 17. And just told me how proud he was of me, and that he was there to support me, and he would always be by my side. And he was tearing up when he was giving me that speech, and I think it was sincere. So I wanted to give people that peek into that childhood. And I think I said something to the effect in the book of, if you're looking at the children to try to figure out if somebody's an abuser, good luck. We had a very normal, very happy, very fun upbringing, and our parents were rock solid.
Yeah, it was the days before the internet.
Yeah.
Right. Cell phones. We actually went out and played until it
just
got
be
dark.
Back by dinner time. I was, I was still in that generation where your parents said, just make sure you're back by dinner. Yeah, by golly, we'd get up first thing in the morning and from the time we were little kids, and we'd go out, we'd play anywhere and everywhere, and then we'd be home by dinner.
Yeah, I think we're about the same age.
Yeah.
Those were good times.
Yeah, for sure.
It sounded like you were a real pistol.
I like to drive, so I started driving. I think I was 7 years old when I started with our. We had an old 3-speed Cub Cadet manual transmission. It was a 3-speed lawn tractor, and I was 7 years old when I started with that, and I was tiny. And then at 9 years old, I started driving. It was a 4-speed manual transmission pickup truck, an old beater Ford pickup truck. So I wrote about that, getting pulled over by the police because I took it on the road. Stealing my sister's friend's station wagon. He was up on the porch talking to my sister, and anytime I saw a vehicle, it was like keys were like candy to me, and I was like, I got to take it for a rip.
It's crazy. Yeah, those were the good old days. I know generally where you grew up, and you mentioned in the book that was where the plane went down on 9/11.
Yep, United 93 in Shanksville.
Yeah, my mother. So your family, you have a great family, and you had no idea that he was a pedophile living a double life. But there was some weird stuff that just kind of didn't feel right, but you couldn't really say what it was. Yeah. What kind of stuff did you remember?
Yeah, so I want to say I want to clarify that a little bit, because as a child, I don't remember any of those things. So this is all post
maybe from your mom
college, and I think just as a kid, you're not looking for little subtle oddities. From a child's perspective, we had a very normal upbringing with a very normal dad, who he was the cool guy who we all wanted to hang out with, and then it was probably starting in college, or maybe even right after I graduated from college, there were a couple little subtle things that weren't like groundbreaking, but they were just odd. Like pulling his camera out at the beach and just seemingly taking random pictures. But then if you actually stopped and looked, you realized, he's intentionally taking pictures of little girls in their bikinis, from teenage and even younger. But it's not one of those things that you were certain that that's what he was doing, because it's not like he would zoom in and, get really focused and, in this zone. It's just he was always had his camera out and would take these pictures. So that was one thing. Just some of the conversations that he would have about babysitting. He obsessed about babysitting other people's kids, and just loved kids so much and loved spending time with kids. And as I got a little bit older, I thought that was really strange, because as somebody who now is a parent, I don't like hanging around other people's kids. I'm just going to be honest. It's not fun. It's not enjoyable. I don't want to do it. I love my kids, and I love spending time with them. Other people's kids, yeah, no thanks. I have no desire to babysit other people's kids, or to hang out with them, or to spend time with them. Just not an interest. So, that was one thing that it never really seemed strange to me until a little bit older. When I became a parent, especially, I was like, that's really bizarre. And my daughter was only 15 months old. My oldest daughter was 15 months old whenever I reported my dad. So I was a brand new parent. And I think that was part of God's timing, because when I had my daughter, that's when my creep meter started going up.
Oh, the creep meter.
Yeah. And I was like, he kept asking my wife and I, like almost demanding if he could bathe our daughter, and we never let him. But my wife and I talked about that, and we're like, it just seems strange. That's a really bizarre request. It's one thing to want to babysit. It's another thing to be so adamant that you want to bathe somebody else's kid, your granddaughter. So thank God we never let him do it. But it was things like that, you know, those were they weren't like blatantly bizarre, but they were bizarre enough.
You said in your book he would take kids on camping trips and stuff, and
yeah, and that was something I didn't know until, I mean, very shortly before my young sister came and disclosed the abuse to me, because I didn't see it. You know, growing up, he didn't do that kind of stuff, at least that I know of. He would camp out with us kids, his own kids, but I never saw that kind of behavior. If it was going on, I didn't see it as a kid.
Wow. So tell us about the horrible day that would change all of your lives forever.
Yeah. So I remember the date because it's just branded on my mind. It was July 29th, 2011. I was 2 years into my job as a minister. And I'm preaching at the same church that my dad preached at. It's my home congregation that I grew up at. So my dad preached where I'm at for 27 years. And you know, I never dreamed that I would be back at my home church. I never wanted to be back at my home church. But the irony is, my wife and I moved back to Somerset because we felt bad for my dad. My mom and dad had just separated. So in January of 2007, we moved up here. 2009, 2 years later, 2.5 years later, it was June of 2009, I got hired full-time as the minister. And then 2 years after that, 2011, my youngest sister, she just contacted me, and Mom had given me a heads up and said that she would be contacting me, my sister Alex. So she contacted me and she said, "Hey, can I come meet with you?" And I said, "Sure." But I knew something was wrong. I could just tell by her tone something was really wrong. So she came in that afternoon, that Friday on July 29th, and she just said hi. That was the only word she said. And she handed me a piece of paper, and it was an email correspondence between her and another victim. And she was asking this other female, "Hey, do you remember that night when, ironically, we had a camp out with our dad?" And she was starting to remember what she thought was a sexual incident that night when she was a little girl. And so the response back was, "Yes, I remember, and I thought I was the only one." So, you know, I looked up at Alex, and she's just sobbing. And I said, "Alex, I believe you." And I said, "You need to know that I have no idea what's going to happen with us knowing this information now. But I said, the one thing that I can promise you is that it stops now." And, you know, I was just trying to process what had been told to me. And I knew, you know, Mom and I, we talked about this on one of our podcast episodes. We knew that we were going to report, because I called Mom as soon as Alex left my office. And I said, "Mom, I assume you know what Alex was coming to tell me." And she had seen the email too, so she knew. And I said, "You know what we have to do, right?" And Mom said, "Absolutely." She said, "We have to report this." So, you know, we made it through the weekend, because it was like 30 minutes or an hour after Alex met with me, I had a wedding rehearsal for some of our church members. I was doing their wedding. Then Saturday I had the wedding, which my dad was at. Sunday I preached. My dad's sitting right there, beaming with pride, you know, sitting 2 rows back, sitting right next to Alex and my wife. And then the next morning, Monday morning, my mom and I were in the police station. And that decision to report, we knew that was going to change our family forever.
Oh, yeah.
And we had no idea what the outcome was going to be. We had no idea how many victims he potentially would have. We had no idea if he was going to be arrested or not. We had no idea if he would find out if we were the ones who reported or not. There were just so many unknowns. And the crazy thing is, the only thing that we knew for certainty was that our lives would forever be changed. Our family would forever be changed by us reporting. That was the only thing that was concrete.
Yes. When I read that in your book, it was, I don't know how you got through that day, got through that weekend without vomiting or somebody to physically hold you up. I don't think I could have done it. I would.
It was incredibly challenging because, we had nothing. We had no reason ever to suspect him of abuse. And then this bombshell is dropped on us. And
you have to pretend like nothing is wrong.
Yeah.
And not show that this man that's sitting across from me is a pedophile.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
And that's the common sense part too, because, this is kind of fascinating too. I had no training whatsoever. And I talked about that in the book. I mean, there was zero training. I went to 9 years of undergraduate and seminary. I have a master's degree in MDiv. 9 years of college, undergraduate and graduate degrees. 9 years, not one lecture on sexual abuse.
That's
not one.
Pathetic.
Yeah. So I had to really listen to common sense, and common sense told me, excuse me, common sense told me that if he knew that we were onto him even a little bit, it would give him all the wiggle room in the world. It would give him time. It would give him time to formulate alibis and excuses, and he would have known who was the one reporting him, so he would have been playing us like a little fiddle. So common sense told me, you don't even let on a little bit that you know anything.
Wow. Yeah, it must have been an Academy Award
Yeah.
performance.
Yeah.
I can relate a little bit to that, because when I left my own abuser, my first marriage, I decided to leave in January when he was out of town, and I left in April, and I had to do the same thing. I had to pretend that everything was okay, and I had to put on a poker face, and I didn't sleep for 4 months.
Yeah.
Because of having to pretend. I didn't want to, like you say, you don't want him to know that something is going on.
Right.
Now, I'll circle back to Alex real quick. And I listened to your podcast when she was finally on your show.
Yeah.
My listeners know that I'm not only had my ex-husband as an abuser, I did go through my my abuse with the guidance counselor in 8th grade at my school. And they all know that the reason why I healed from that was because my parents believed me. Yeah. And my principal at the school believed me, and the police believed me, and I was very fortunate. But I know that is not the norm. And I'm so thankful that you believed Alex, and I'm sure she is grateful that she had you and your mom that believed her.
Well, and I think that's the other thing. Her life would have been forever changed for the worse had we not believed. Her life changed along with all of ours that day too. That was her decision to disclose that abuse to mom and me was a life-changing event for all of us. And that would have played out very differently for Alex had we not believed her. And you're right. I mean, unfortunately, that's the norm for victims of any kind of abuse who speak up about it. And that breaks my heart, and it makes me infuriated, because I have people come back to me, I've consulted with churches before, and that's why I have that chapter on the theology behind it, and starting with God's foundation of righteousness and justice. That word for righteousness means balanced scales. God's very foundation it's not love. When I ask people what God's foundation is, that's almost always unanimously the answer that I get back. God's foundation is love. No, it's not.
It's holiness.
Yeah, it's
God is holy.
Sure, it's righteousness and justice. Psalm 89:14. Righteousness and justice are your foundation. Steadfast love and faithfulness flow from it. So, that foundation of righteousness not tipping the scales is incredibly important, because without realizing that people are doing it, they're tipping the scales for the abuser. They're placing their finger, literally, quite literally, they're placing their finger on the scale of justice in favor of the abuser by saying things like, well, it couldn't be him. I've known him my whole life.
Or
We're
she's
best
making
friends.
it up.
Yeah, they're the pillar of the community. You hear all these statements that tip the scale in favor of the abuser. And at the end of the day, again, I think this was just common sense for me. Nothing about my relationship with my father mattered in that moment. What mattered were the facts that were presented before me. That was it. Alex gave me very credible information. She gave me facts. And so in order to have a balanced scale where Alex is on one side, my dad is on the other, I had no right to tip that scale in either direction. And that's incredibly difficult to do. So when I consult with churches, I understand why people don't believe survivors, but I'm also not tolerant towards it.
No.
So I have people, they'll try to bank on their relationships, and they'll say things like, well, you're asking us to report this person, and we run the risk of ruining a perfectly good person's reputation. And I'm like, no, let me stop you right there. This person ruined their own reputation when they did these horrific things, when they did these crimes. They enacted these crimes against very innocent people. If anybody's reputation is tarnished, it's theirs, and it's their own fault. If these allegations are credible and they pan out, which, over 97% of the time they do.
Yeah, or they do what they did to Sandy. They made her out to be some evil temptress.
Sure. Yeah.
She was, 14?
Right. Yeah.
Like, really?
Yeah.
Gonna blame it on the girl?
That's why I spend so much time talking about it, and why I wrote about it. And, we've got to get people to change that mentality. And I have zero sympathy for people who do it. I had one guy, he was a church leader, and he said it was one of their elders who had covered up horrific abuse within his own family. And the pastor of that church said, I played golf with this guy for 20 years, and he's my mentor and, my best friend. And he said, I run a very high risk of getting fired if I follow through and do what you're telling me to do to report this. And what translation, he didn't want to report it because he had such a good relationship with this man, and he didn't want to break his, little precious family apart. And I said, I'm not sure if you know my story, but I'm the wrong person to use the argument that I've known this person for 20 years of my life and we're best friends. I was like, I'm the wrong person to make that argument to.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, I said in that moment too, I was like, Jesus asks us to lay our lives down for innocent people. You're not even willing to lay your job down. What does that say about you? And he didn't know what to say. And I don't know if it was him, but somebody who was in that meeting with me reported the abuse, and that uncovered all kinds of issues in this church. There were all kinds of things that were hiding below the surface. And, among other leaders, they had other leaders that were abusing people in different ways. They had, affairs going on and all kinds of bizarre stuff that they never knew about until they reported this one elder.
I think I tagged you in an article I read about that camp counselor. Oh, gee, I should have written a name down, but he was sexually abusing boys at the camp. I think the camp was in Pennsylvania. And then the owners of the camp knew about it. And even the parents complained. And still this guy was, the camp counselor.
Yeah.
And they're finally cracking down on this guy. But yeah, the stories behind him abusing these boys, and like you say, in plain sight.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody did anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's too common. It's way, way, way too common.
It's worse than people think it is.
Yeah.
Now that I'm in this industry, it's like it's worse than I ever thought.
Yeah.
So your story just gets worse as you go down to the police station. So what happens when you go down to the police station? What happens after that?
Yeah. So at the police station, the detective, I'm actually good friends with. I officiated the wedding for her two nephews. It's a small town, and turns out she's the sex crimes detective in our town, and she's really good at what she does. And I remember she told my mom and I when we were in the police station, she said, "I'm just going to brace you now." She said, when I call your dad in, there are going to be a lot of victims. And that shocked me. Of course now I expect it.
Mm-hmm.
But not knowing anything about abuse, I had no idea that pedophiles would have all these victims and that they could possibly cover it up for decades. So I was in a little bit of denial with that, but I trusted her enough to really believe that. And she was really blunt with us, and she said, because we kept trying to be a little bit sympathetic toward my dad, and kind of like hinting a little bit for her to take it easy on him, not coming right out and saying it, but we were just implying that he was kind of fragile, and he's a really nice guy. And she kept stopping us, and she's like, "You guys don't need to have any sympathy for him." She's like, "He's a disgusting child rapist." And she's like, "I'm telling you, there are going to be a lot of victims. You guys really need to mentally brace yourself for what you're about to find out." She was 100% right. She called him in for questioning, and she called me up as soon as he left the police station, and she was audibly shaken up. And this is a woman who investigates sex crimes every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Jimmy, it's really bad." And she's like, in the 30 years or however long she's been doing this, she said, "This is quite possibly going to be the worst case that I've ever had." She's like, "Your dad is a very horrific abuser." And she said, "Your dad's probably going to call you as soon as he leaves the station here," because she said, "Of course, I didn't tell him that you were the one who reported." And so no sooner I hung up with her, my phone rings, and I look at the caller ID, and it's my dad. I was like, "Oh crap." And I mean, that's when I felt like vomiting. And then he wanted me to come over to his apartment, which I did. And he said, get some things off his chest. So I went over there, and he just rambled. And I describe it to people like it's like trying to listen to Charlie Sheen and make sense of a single sentence that he's making. That's what it sounded like. Charlie Sheen, when he rambles and he just talks nonsense, you have no idea what he's talking about. That was my dad, and I had never seen that side of him. He had always been really articulate and just always put together, always calm, always laid back. And I could tell he was scared.
Yeah, he was in shock that he got caught.
Yeah. Which quite honestly it gave me a little bit of satisfaction to see him that way, because when I hung up with Detective Beckner, and to hear her that shaken up over what my dad had just confessed, I knew it was really bad. And so I knew every victim that he confessed to was suffering so much because of my dad. So to see him panicked and to see him scared for the first time ever in his life brought some satisfaction to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a form of justice. Because
That's
he
true.
knew he was going to jail. He didn't know when, he didn't know for how long, but he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt he was going to jail.
Right. And then you had to tell your family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we went away. He wasn't called in right away. We reported on a Monday, and I think a few days went by before he was called in for questioning. So that first weekend after Alex disclosed to me, we had a trip down to one of our Christian universities that we had planned for a long time. Our church was we took a van down, and it was a Sunday school teacher conference. And the incoming president of the university happened to be best friends with my dad. They went to college together. They both were from Pennsylvania. They went to Israel together.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were best friends. And so we landed on the campus, got out of the van on the campus of this university. First person I saw was my dad's friend, the president, Dr. Shank. And he came up to me, and the first thing he says, "Hey, Jimmy, how's your dad doing?" And I just, I wrote the phrase in the book, I wanted to melt into the sidewalk. I never felt so awful. And I had to lie through my teeth because family members still didn't know. I had siblings who still didn't know yet that we had reported my dad. And, we had this groundbreaking news that, he now confessed to 23 victims. I had family members who had no idea that we even reported him yet. So while I was on that college campus, and our church group is having the time of their lives, it's like this really encouraging trip, I'm sneaking off and making phone calls to siblings of mine to tell them that, by the way, I reported dad for raping little kids, including some of our sisters. How do you break that news to people over the phone?
You had no choice.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's those kinds of things, those ripple effects that people just don't think about. And there's so many different dynamics. And it's not just that you report. And that's part of my beef with mandated reporting training. I've been to so many trainings, and they're so dry. They're so boring. They're so full of misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And then they talk about mandated reporting, and they just talk about it like, yeah, you're a mandated reporter. So, if you see something, say something. That phrase, that mantra is repeated over and over. And I'm like, shouldn't there be training on the psychological impact of reporting? Because most people who report, they're either going to be reporting a family member or a coworker or a boss or somebody who they know really, really well. 80+% of the time, they're going to be reporting somebody who they know well, who they're really close to. So there ought to be some more training that doesn't make it sound like you're reading off the menu at Starbucks, because that's not what it's like when you're walking into that police station.
Or Ben Stein voice.
Yeah, right.
So your siblings, were they just as shocked? Were they?
They weren't, and the emotions were all over the place. I mean, we had everything from explosive anger to some were angry with me because there's that initial shock and denial. that fortunately with some of my siblings only lasted for a total of maybe 5 minutes, literally. But there's that initial shock and disbelief and, trying to process all this information all at once. And so a couple of them were upset that I would go to the police station without ever talking to my dad. And, and then when I explained things a little bit, they were like, oh, like, no, we are fully supportive of what you did. Like, you had to do
good.
that. Yeah.
That's good. And you wanted the church to know what was going on before it hit the papers or the news, of course, because,
Yes.
the churches are.
Yeah. So that was another interesting dynamic because my dad had been the preacher there for 27 years. Most of the people there, he baptized.
Mm-hmm.
They sat at the feet of him preaching just like I had. And so what I didn't want to ever happen was for me to give bits of information that gave anybody any wiggle room whatsoever to defend my dad.
Right.
So the message had to be really clear, really precise, and very pointed and informational. But at the same time, it was walking this balance because I didn't know who his victims were until right before he was arrested. I had no idea. Besides for a few family members, I had no idea. And then just a couple days before he was arrested, we went out for coffee, and that's when he started naming names, and he rattled off. I mean, just very nonchalantly. He said, oh, by the way, just so that you know what you're dealing with when I get canned, here are the names of my victims. He said it just like that. And then he just starts rattling them off. And I sat there in utter shock.
Mm-hmm.
And every single name that he mentioned was, I saw a face with it. And it's these little kids. And then he started naming little kids that were in my church that were still little kids. He abused them up to the time of his arrest.
And you're in a diner, and eating soup or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I would have been able to control myself.
Yeah.
Put my arms around it, put my hands around his throat or something.
Oh, I was tempted. Yeah, the thought crossed my mind.
I don't know. I don't know how you did.
Yeah. But that was the part, that was my next worst fear, because it's like living in this constant nightmare that never ends, and you're awake.
Yeah.
And I was like, how could this possibly get worse? Oh, I know. If he has victims in my church too. And then he starts rattling names off, and sure enough. So then that brought up a whole nother dilemma, because we were so shocked and broken and just trying to process everything that was happening. I mean, this was all within 3 weeks. From the time Alex came in my office till my dad was arrested was 3 weeks. That is a very short amount of time to get that kind of information, to try to process, figure out how you're going to tell the church, when you're going to tell them, what you're going to tell them. And then to tell the parents, because we had to tell the parents of those victims before we told the church. And then, of course, we couldn't tell the church that there were victims in the church, and the parents asked us not to tell them. So it's just all these different angles that there was not one thing in graduate school, in college or graduate school, that prepared me for it. And I thought, looking back, I almost didn't write that in the book. But then I thought, I know people from my college and seminary are going to read this. Some of my professors are going to read it, and they need to.
My college didn't have any training in that. We had new thetic counseling, but that was it.
Yeah. But I thought it's fair game. Like, they need to know. And I've been doing this for 10 years. And people at my college and seminary, they know who I am. They know my story. They know what I do. I've spoken at lectureships at my alma maters. And I've never been contacted to teach a course or to have a discussion, or never.
So that's why I'm so passionate about mending the soul, because the founder, Stephen Tracy, he's here from Phoenix. He's the professor at, he's an ethics and theology professor at Phoenix Seminary, and that's what he teaches. He teaches abuse to the students there that are under his tutelage. So somebody is finally doing it, and he and his wife started Mending the Soul as a response to some abuse that happened in their family.
Yeah.
And they said there were no resources, they had no training. His wife was a trauma counselor, but they were just blindsided by abuse, just like you were, and that's how they started their ministry. So really very passionate about what he does as well.
Yeah. It's just incredible to me. I mean, there's no excuse for it. And I can't ever understand the blatant willingness to not talk about this and not teach this in college and seminary to Bible students. I can't wrap my mind around it. There's no excuse for it. There's no excuse. They know it's happening. I know of instances that have happened at both of my alma maters, both college and seminary. I know of plenty of instances. It's on their radar. They know it's happening. They've had it happen with students of theirs. They've had it happen with professors of theirs. They know it's happening.
Yep.
There's just no excuse.
Now, okay, folks, we're going to have a part 2 of Jimmy's interview. As you can tell, he's a great speaker, great conversationalist, and an expert in his field. So I'd like you to tune in next week for part 2 of this interview, where we find out what happens to Jimmy's father and the aftermath of the abuse. So until then, remember that you are no longer a victim, you are victorious. God bless you.
Thank you for listening to the Wounds of the Faithful podcast. If this episode has been helpful to you, please hit the subscribe button and tell a friend. You can connect with us at dswministries.org, where you'll find our blog along with our Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel links. Hope to see you next week.